Two men were found lying motionless across a frozen snowbank, their equipment scattered across the slush in a radius consistent with a high-speed impact event. One rifle lay 10 feet from its owner, unfired. The other sat empty near a trail of dark fluid in the snow. The investigation would confirm that a single lapse in situational awareness had produced 2 fatalities in under 6 seconds. In the Alaskan interior, in the spring of 1955, near Snowshoe Lake, located off the Glen Highway, the air temperature on this specific afternoon sat at approximately 34 Fahrenheit degrees. The terrain was a punishing combination of waist-deep snowdrifts and exposed, jagged gravel, a landscape actively transitioning from the locked silence of winter to the volatile, unpredictable energy of the spring thaw. The light was flat and diffuse, casting almost no shadow across the white hillside. Under those conditions, the subtle surface depressions that indicate a hidden den are nearly impossible to read at distance. Lloyd "Penny" Pennington was a veteran bush pilot with years of Alaskan backcountry experience. His companion, Everett Kendall, was a local barber and an experienced hunter. Both men were familiar with this terrain, which is precisely why the events that followed are so forensically significant. Familiarity breeds a particular kind of cognitive vulnerability, the assumption that a known landscape carries known risks. To see why the charge was unavoidable, we have to look at the specific positioning of the two men in the minutes before contact. After working toward a den site, Pennington and Kendall had retreated approximately 100 yards downslope to a fallen spruce. They sat for a cigarette break, leaning their rifles against the timber. At 2 p.m., both men were physically separated from their primary defense. That gap, measured in feet, not yards, would determine the outcome of the next 6 seconds. As Kendall stood to resume the climb, a grizzly bear emerged from a dense thicket of alder brush. There was no bluff charge, no vocalization, no postural warning. The animal moved directly into a full-speed gallop. To visualize the physics, consider a mass of approximately 600 pounds accelerating to 35 miles per hour across compacted snow and gravel. The bear covered the 30-yard gap in under 3 seconds. Kendall managed 3 steps before the animal's shoulder connected with his upper torso, driving him face first into the frozen crust. The angle of impact was direct and lateral simultaneously. The bear's forward momentum transferred entirely into Kendall's cervical spine. The clinical assessment would later indicate an immediate fracture at that junction. Pennington, positioned several feet away, witnessed the strike in real time. He reached for his rifle. To understand what happened in the next 4 seconds, we have to look at the physiology of extreme, acute stress. The surge of adrenaline that floods the system during a startle response of this magnitude causes measurable degradation of fine motor control. The hands shake, grip weakens, and the precision required to cycle a bolt-action rifle becomes genuinely difficult. Despite this, Pennington managed to chamber and fire 3 rounds. 1 bullet connected with the bear's foot. It was not sufficient. A strike to the extremity does not interrupt the forward momentum of an animal of this mass. The bear's charge remained fully kinetic. The bear pivoted toward Pennington. Its center of gravity dropped low as it closed the remaining distance. The animal's jaws locked onto Pennington's forearm, exerting a bite force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch. Both the radius and ulna shattered instantly under that load. As Pennington was driven into the snow under the animal's full weight, he sustained multiple crush injuries to the cranium and neck, producing a rapid loss of consciousness.
Medical findings and aftermath. The field assessment of Everett Kendall revealed a complete absence of defensive wounds. This is a clinically significant detail. The lack of any protective posturing, no raised arms, no turned torso, indicates the nervous system had not processed the threat before the fatal impact to the head occurred. The speed of the strike had outpaced the body's threat response cycle entirely. Pennington's injuries told a different story. Massive blood loss from the carotid region and severe compound fractures of the upper extremities, evidence of a sustained, desperate struggle. Neither man survived the initial encounter. Long-term physical limitations are therefore not applicable to the victims. The long-term consequences fell instead on the community. A search party, led by a man named Rick Houston, conducted a grueling 30-mile traverse through the valley to locate the bear. When the animal was found, it displayed a significant behavioral anomaly. It stood on its hind legs and swatted at a low-flying bush plane during the search, an aggressive posture that is highly atypical for a bear that has already made a kill. The animal was neutralized at a distance of 20 feet after a sustained volley of gunfire by the search party. Incident analysis. 2 primary tactical failures produced this outcome. The first was the decision to rest within 100 yards of an active den. In terrain with documented predator density, 100 yards represents approximately 7 seconds of travel time for a grizzly at full gallop, a window that is functionally useless for reaction and response. The hunters treated that distance as a buffer. It was not. The second failure was the physical separation of the men from their rifles. In the moment the startle response was triggered, neither man could immediately access his primary defense. The gap between a leaned rifle and a hand wrapped around a grip is measured in fractions of a second. In this encounter, those fractions were decisive. Practical takeaway. Vigilance is not a state you can suspend and resume. Within range of a known active den, your defense must remain in your hands, not leaned against timber, not slung across your back. 100 yards is not a margin of safety. In the Alaskan wilderness, it is a starting line. The recovery team rounded a jagged ice berm to find a scatter of high-visibility nylon and dark biological matter pressed into the frozen slush. A heavy-caliber rifle lay yards away, bolt closed, a live round still chambered, completely untouched during the encounter. The physical evidence confirmed that the Arctic's largest terrestrial predator had transitioned from a chance proximity event to a successful predatory kill in a matter of seconds. To understand the baseline conditions of this incident, we have to establish the sensory environment of the Canadian Arctic during a standard subsistence hunt. On this day, 2 experienced First Nations hunters, Tak and his cousin Nat, had traveled 47 miles by snowmobile from their village out onto the expansive sea ice. The ambient temperature hovered at approximately 15 Fahrenheit degrees. At that temperature, the air is dry and acoustically efficient. Sound travels significant distances across open ice. However, the soft, packed surface of the snow also has an inverse property. It absorbs the footfalls of large animals with near total efficiency. The light was the characteristic flat white of the Arctic, a condition that eliminates shadows and severely degrades depth perception. The 2 men were positioned at seal breathing holes, apertures in the ice roughly 18 inches in diameter, waiting in place. When Nat departed to scout a secondary location a quarter-mile away, he left Tak behind a snowblind. From that moment forward, both men were isolated in a featureless landscape that offered no vertical cover, no elevation advantage, and no line of sight to one another. To see why the attack on one man was unavoidable while the other survived, we have to examine the microbeats of the predator's approach and the physiological state of the stationary target. Tak had been motionless behind the snowblind for an extended period. Prolonged stillness in sub-freezing temperatures produces a measurable physiological effect. The heart rate suppresses, core temperature drops incrementally, and the body's threat detection systems fall into a lower state of readiness. A male polar bear, utilizing massive fur-covered paws that function as natural acoustic dampeners, approached Tak from the rear. When Tak finally registered a presence and turned, the bear was 4 feet away. At that range, the animal was moving in a slow, inquisitive stalk rather than an active charge. Tak's system flooded immediately with cortisol. The resulting physiological cascade, elevated heart rate, loss of fine motor control, the tremble response, made shouldering a rifle a non-viable option at 4 feet of separation. Tak chose passive defense. He collapsed into a fetal position on the ice surface and remained motionless. The bear pressed its nose against Tak's cheek, conducting an extended olfactory assessment. The animal's weight shifted the surface ice slightly beneath Tak's body. After a period of investigation, the bear's behavioral mode shifted. It had assessed the stationary, unresponsive Tak as non-viable. It then picked up the fresh, high-energy scent trail of Nat's recent movement, footprints and snowmobile tracks moving across open ice. The predator transitioned from curiosity to active pursuit, tracking Nat's trail like a scent hound working a line.
Medical findings and aftermath. Clinical evidence from the recovery scene indicated that Nat's death was near instantaneous. The bear had delivered a predatory bite to the posterior of the cranium and the cervical vertebrae, a strike pattern consistent with the killing method used by polar bears on large prey. This type of impact produces immediate neurological shutdown, with no prolonged struggle and no extended period of suffering. The documented psychological effects on Tak included acute stress disorder, characterized by recurring sensory triggers, the smell of organic decay, and the specific physical sensation of the bear's whiskers against his skin. Within the village, the incident produced a factual reevaluation of solo and split-pair hunting protocols. Incident analysis. The primary tactical failure was the decision to separate in an environment combining low visibility with high predator density. By moving a quarter mile from Tak's position, Nat converted himself into a moving target. A polar bear's predatory drive is more reliably triggered by movement than by a stationary object. The snow blind, while providing frontal concealment, eliminated Tak's rear situational awareness entirely, leaving his 6 o'clock position unmonitored and exposed. Tak's decision to play dead was a calculated risk that succeeded. Any abrupt movement or a failed attempt to reach his rifle at 4 feet of separation would likely have triggered an immediate clinch and bite response. By remaining motionless and suppressing all vocalization, Tak presented as a non-threat, and the bear's assessment reflected that. Practical takeaway. In the Arctic, silence is not safety. It is concealment for the predator, not for you. Hunting partners must remain within 50 yards of each other to provide effective mutual overwatch. Vigilance must cover 360 degrees at all times. On the sea ice, you are not only hunting, you are also being evaluated. The recovery team discovered a high-end digital camera resting in the silt of the Toklat River, its lens casing cracked, its body stained with dark, organic residue. Nearby, a backpack lay overturned, its straps severed as if cut by high-tension shears. The physical evidence confirmed that the victim had been transitioned from an active photographer to a cached food source in a matter of minutes. Denali National Park, August 2012. The specific location was approximately 3 miles south of the park road, a braided landscape of shifting gravel bars, glacial river channels, and dense willow thickets that grow to shoulder height along the waterline. The air temperature was approximately 58 Fahrenheit degrees, with a light wind that shifted direction frequently across the open valley floor. Richard White was 49 years old and carried 3 decades of backcountry experience. On this day, he was moving through the riparian corridor with a camera focused on wildlife photography. The light conditions were ideal for high shutter speed work, sharp and directional, with strong contrast across the gravel bars. However, the sound environment was a significant variable. The rushing glacial water of the Toklot creates a continuous acoustic mask across the valley, one that would have suppressed the auditory signals of both the human and the bear until the physical distance between them had already been critically reduced. The required safety perimeter in Denali is 440 yards from any bear. The digital file record indicates White had closed that gap to approximately 50 yards. For 8 minutes, the male grizzly maintained a grazing posture, center of gravity low, weight distributed forward, consuming riparian vegetation along the bank. At frame 27, the animal's behavior changed with no intermediate warning stage. To understand the mechanics of what followed, we have to examine the physics of the transition. The bear shifted its weight to its hindquarters in the same motion as it launched into a gallop, a movement that can sustain speeds of 35 miles per hour. On the uneven silt and gravel of the riverbank, the bear's wide paws provided traction that White's hiking boots could not match on the same surface. As the distance closed from 150 feet to zero, White's sympathetic nervous system would have entered a state of total dominance. Elevated heart rate, tunneled visual field, degraded fine motor coordination. The forensic significance of what happened next is clinical. The camera remained raised. White did not drop the equipment, did not widen his stance, and did not deploy bear spray. This behavioral pattern has been documented in other wildlife photography incidents and is referred to as viewfinder bias, a cognitive lock-in which the act of framing a shot overrides the threat assessment process. The angle of impact was lateral. A 600-pound mass moving at speed carries sufficient kinetic energy to produce immediate blunt force trauma on contact. The camera was knocked into the mud. Forensic evidence indicates the bear then utilized a clinch and bite maneuver, targeting the head and neck, a pattern consistent with neutralizing a perceived threat rather than a prey drive response. White was then dragged into the brush.
Medical findings and aftermath. The immediate field evidence indicated predatory cache behavior. After neutralizing White, the bear moved the body from the open riverbank into adjacent brush and covered it with dirt and vegetation, a biological strategy for protecting a caloric resource from competing scavengers. This behavior pattern is well documented in grizzly interactions with large prey. Recovery efforts were complicated by the animal's persistent territorial defense of the cache site. When park rangers arrived by helicopter, approximately 2.5 hours after the initial discovery by a separate hiking party, the bear remained at the site, circling with a lowered head and aggressive posture. Due to failing light and the direct risk to the recovery personnel, full extraction of White's remains was postponed until the following Saturday. A subsequent necropsy of the bear confirmed it had consumed a significant portion of the victim. Incident analysis. The primary failure was the intentional breach of the 440-yard mandatory perimeter. By closing to 50 yards, White had entered the bear's reactive threshold, the distance at which the animal's response time is faster than the human's. At that proximity, a behavioral shift from neutral to charge leaves no window for effective counteraction. The secondary failure was the failure to transition from camera to bear spray as the animal's behavior changed. The forensic record suggests White remained behind the lens through the critical window when a defensive response might still have been possible. Practical takeaway. A long-range lens is a safety tool, not just an artistic one. Closing the distance for a better frame means trading your reaction window for resolution. In the backcountry, the mandatory distance exists because the animal's decision cycle is faster than yours. The quarter-mile threshold is not a guideline. It is the architecture of survival.
The recovery team found the snowmobile still idling, its track spinning slowly against a bank of compressed, crimson-stained slush. A high-caliber rifle lay slung across a discarded jacket nearby, its safety engaged, its barrel packed with snow, untouched during the attack. The physical evidence revealed a transition from mechanical pursuit to biological ambush in under 4 seconds. To understand the sensory baseline of this encounter, we have to look at the environment of the Seward Peninsula near Nome, Alaska, in May 2011. The terrain was a volatile mix of melting snowpack, exposed willow thickets, and frozen creek beds in various stages of collapse. The air temperature was approximately 32 Fahrenheit degrees, a heavy, damp atmosphere produced by the freeze-thaw boundary. At that temperature, moisture in the air muffles the sound of footsteps and biological movement, while the mechanical drone of a snowmobile engine carries for miles across the open landscape. The combination creates a specific acoustic asymmetry. The hunters announced their location constantly, while the terrain absorbed all sound produced by the predator. Wes Perkins, 54 years old, was a former fire chief and experienced outdoorsman. He was tracking a 13-year-old male grizzly alongside his partners, Edward and Dan Stang. The light was flat and diffuse, characteristic of Alaskan spring, a condition that flattens contours and makes white-on-white terrain features difficult to read. Perkins had just navigated around a dense thicket. 70 feet behind him, in a shallow snow cave, the thermal signature of a 500-pound predator was cooling, invisible in the flat light, silent in the muffled air. To see why the charge was unavoidable, we have to examine the terrain geometry and the specific moment of transition that preceded the strike. Perkins had stopped his snowmobile and dismounted to retrieve a camera. In doing so, he converted from a moving operator to a stationary target. He also placed himself on the wrong side of the thicket relative to his rifle, slung across his back rather than held in a ready position. The physics of the ambush were governed by elevation and explosive acceleration. The Grizzly launched from a slightly elevated position on the slope, utilizing a quadrupedal gallop that carried it across the 70-foot gap in approximately 2 seconds. The animal's gait was a low-profile surge, a flat trajectory designed to minimize both wind resistance and acoustic signature. The angle of impact was lateral, connecting with Perkins as he turned toward the sound of breaking brush. The physiological consequences were immediate and severe. As the bear's mass collided with Perkins's torso, the kinetic energy produced an instantaneous failure of balance and skeletal support. Before any attempt to reach the slung rifle was possible, the bear's jaws clamped across Perkins's midface. A bite force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch resulted in multi-fragmentary fractures of the maxilla and mandible. Perkins sustained total loss of vision in his right eye from orbital trauma and massive arterial hemorrhage from the facial vasculature. Despite the severity of the injuries, he did not lose consciousness, a physiological outcome attributed to a massive surge of norepinephrine that suppressed the brain's standard pain response shutdown mechanism.
Medical findings and aftermath. The immediate field diagnosis upon the arrival of the Stang brothers was a total facial avulsion and open comminuted fractures of the skull. The bear had mechanically removed Perkins's nasal structure and sinus cavities. Because Perkins could no longer produce speech, the jaw trauma and partial loss of his tongue made vocalization impossible, he employed a tactical communication method, clenching the hands of his brother Nate to signal his level of consciousness and the location of his pain. This preserved the response team's ability to focus on hemorrhage control while a rescue helicopter, piloted by Ben Rowe, made its approach. The recovery period required transport to Harbor View Medical Center in Seattle, where Perkins was placed in a medically induced coma for 5 days. Over the course of 26 surgeries, the reconstruction involved a fibula free flap, using a segment of his own leg bone to rebuild the jaw, and titanium plating to reconstruct the zygomatic arches. Total medical expenses exceeded $1 million. Incident analysis. 2 failures produced this outcome. The first was the decision to dismount and step away from the primary weapon while 70 feet from a thicket that had just absorbed a bear's trail. A predator that has entered cover cannot be tracked visually, which means every second of non-visual contact is a second in which the distance between hunter and animal is unknown. The second failure was the rifle's configuration, slung rather than carried at the ready, which eliminated the response window entirely when the charge came from 2 seconds of separation. The intervention of the Stang brothers, who shot the bear off Perkins, was the direct mechanical action that prevented a fatality. Perkins' ability to remain cognitively present and communicate through hand signals prevented the physiological collapse into shock that would likely have caused fatal blood pressure loss before the helicopter arrived. Practical takeaway. When tracking an apex predator through dense cover, losing visual contact is not a pause in the hunt. It is the beginning of the ambush. Your weapon belongs in your hands. If you are close enough to read the tracks, the animal is close enough to read yours.
The emergency department in Jasper, Alberta, received 2 climbers just after midnight, their technical gear coated in a mixture of alpine ice and dark arterial spray. One man's mountaineering boot had been punctured through reinforced leather and synthetic insulation, the structural integrity of the footwear failing under thousands of pounds of concentrated pressure. The physical evidence confirmed that a high-altitude descent had converted into a fight for survival against a predator that, by all biological accounts, should have been dormant. To establish the sensory baseline of this encounter, we have to look at the specific conditions of Wilson Peak in November 2015. Greg Boswell and Nick Bullock, 2 of the world's most accomplished technical alpine climbers, had just completed a demanding ascent of a route designated Dirty Love. The ambient temperature at elevation was approximately 14 Fahrenheit degrees, a dry, lung-contracting cold that makes each breath a deliberate act. The night of the encounter was a new moon. The mountain was in absolute darkness, with the only visual information available coming from the narrow, moving beams of their headlamps, a cone of light extending roughly 20 feet in any direction, leaving the flanks and rear of each climber in total blackness. The descent terrain consisted of knee-deep powder snow over angled limestone, a surface that offers near-zero reliable traction for bipedal movement under load and at speed. The 2 men were navigating a transition zone between steep technical rock and the lower forest line, a corridor where the constant sound of wind through the pines generates a persistent white noise baseline. As Greg stopped at a high-altitude spring to fill a water bottle, a brief stationary task, a grizzly bear emerged from beyond the periphery of his headlamp's reach. The animal's gait was a high-energy gallop, its paws splaying across the deep snow to distribute weight, an evolutionary advantage that maintained speed on a surface where the humans were struggling to maintain basic footing. The bear's estimated speed was approximately 30 miles per hour. As Greg turned to flee, he lost his footing on the ice, concealed beneath the powder. He went down prone. The bear closed the remaining distance and deployed a clinch and lift maneuver, jaws locking onto Greg's lower leg and hoisting his body weight off the ground entirely. The pressure was sufficient to penetrate a specialized climbing boot, a piece of equipment engineered to withstand repeated impact against rock faces and crampon points. The teeth bypassed the exterior material, compressed the muscle layer, and made direct contact with the bone. The immediate physiological result was a total loss of motor control in the lower limb, as the peroneal nerve was compressed under the load. Grip strength in Greg's hands vanished simultaneously.
a reflex response to the neurological interruption in the lower extremity. Medical findings and aftermath. Upon arrival at the hospital in Jasper, the initial assessment revealed deep, multi-point puncture wounds to the lower leg and thigh. The bear's canines had reached the bone, but had not severed the femoral artery. The recovery period involved a series of soft tissue repair surgeries. Because Boswell was in peak physical condition at the time of the attack, his long-term physical limitations were minimal. Following intensive rehabilitation, targeting a full range of motion in the ankle and knee, he returned to professional-level climbing within months. A recovery timeline that reflects both the quality of acute care received and the baseline physiological resilience of an elite athlete. During the subsequent 5-hour descent from the mountain in darkness, Bullock operated under a continuous cognitive framework that a second attack was imminent. He later stated he had mentally committed to unclipping from his rappelling safety system and accepting a fall rather than face a second encounter while immobilized on a cliff face. Incident analysis. Because they were operating in sub-freezing temperatures in late November, both men had concluded the hibernation window for bears in the area had closed. This assumption produced a gear failure of omission. Neither was carrying bear spray or any secondary deterrent within reach. In high-altitude environments with sufficient late-season food availability, grizzlies may remain active well beyond the calendar dates associated with denning behavior. The darkness of the new moon compounded this. Situational awareness was constrained to a 20-foot forward arc, leaving both flanks and the rear entirely unmonitored. The critical effective action was Nick Bullock's transition from defensive paralysis to active intervention. By arming himself with a technical climbing axe, a tool engineered to penetrate ice, and physically advancing toward the bear, Bullock applied sufficient psychological pressure to break the animal's focus. Greg's own mechanical contribution, kicking himself free of the bear's grip despite the crush load on his leg, provided the separation needed to reach cover. Practical takeaway. In the alpine environment, biological calendars are not guarantees. A predator's activity is governed by caloric availability and local temperature, not by the month. Your safety gear must match the terrain you are moving through, not the season printed on a calendar. If you are in the mountains after dark, your situational awareness must extend beyond your headlamp. Everything outside that light is unknown. The recovery team found the rocky soil of the ridge saturated with dark biological fluid, marking the exact point where a 450-pound sow had transitioned from observation to a full defensive charge. Scattered among the trampled brush were fragments of research equipment and shattered high-density polyethylene, physical evidence of a high-energy impact that unfolded in under 3 seconds. The victim lay motionless, his facial structure mechanically separated from the underlying bone by a force no research protocol had anticipated. To understand the sensory baseline of this encounter, we have to establish the environment of Bighorn Pass near Yellowstone National Park during a 6-day backcountry research expedition. The air temperature that morning was approximately 42 Fahrenheit degrees, a chill that kept the local vegetation damp and suppressed the sound of footfalls on the forest floor. The light was sharp and directional, characteristic of high-altitude ridgelines, producing pockets of deep shadow within the stands of whitebark pine that bordered the trail system. Barry Gilbert was a seasoned field researcher from Utah State University. His graduate assistant accompanied him. The two had spent the previous day in a controlled observation scenario, documenting a sow grizzly successfully defending her 3 cubs against an aggressive boar. Their professional competence was not in question. What the terrain itself had produced was a specific blind spot condition. A single topographical rise was sufficient to completely conceal a 450-pound predator from 2 trained observers
until the separation between them had closed to under 20 feet. To see why the charge was unavoidable, we have to look at the terrain geometry and the specific sequence of movement that placed Gilbert on a direct collision course with the sow he had been studying. Gilbert had stepped away from the main camp to a small rise in the ground, a routine maneuver. On the opposite side of that rise, the sow and her 3 cubs were moving at a steady walking pace in the opposite direction. Upon mutual visual contact at 15 feet, the bear's gait shifted from a walk to a full predatory lunge in a single motion. There was no intermediate posturing. The terrain offered Gilbert no viable lateral retreat. Loose shale and low-growth huckleberry provided zero stable footing for a rapid directional change. The sow deployed a bite-and-shake maneuver, a defensive reflex biologically designed to neutralize a perceived threat to offspring. Her jaws connected with Gilbert's cranium at a force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch. The result was an immediate scalp avulsion, the mechanical tearing of the scalp away from the skull in a single motion. The force of the strike was sufficient for the bear's teeth to hook into the zygomatic arches, the cheekbones, pulling them away from the facial midline. Gilbert experienced instantaneous vision loss in one eye as the orbital socket was crushed inward. Loss of fine motor control and grip strength followed immediately as the combined trauma overloaded the peripheral nervous system's capacity to maintain voluntary muscle function.
Medical findings and aftermath. The immediate field treatment was facilitated by a statistical anomaly that is almost without precedent in backcountry medicine. A team of smoke jumpers was conducting training operations in the immediate vicinity. That team included an experienced Vietnam-era combat pilot and a contingent of battlefield trauma surgeons. These specialists were able to apply clinical-grade hemorrhage control within minutes of the attack, a standard of care that is essentially unavailable in any other backcountry scenario. The field diagnosis was catastrophic facial trauma, open fractures of the maxilla, and complete loss of soft tissue covering the frontal bone. The recovery period began with emergency medical evacuation to a regional trauma center, where Gilbert underwent an 11-hour reconstructive surgery. The long-term physical limitations were permanent: total blindness in one eye and significant facial disfigurement. His cognitive function remained fully intact. Gilbert returned to his academic position at Utah State University and eventually documented the attack and his recovery in his memoir, One of Us, A Biologist's Walk Among Bears. Incident analysis. The primary error was the silent cresting of a topographical rise, approaching the crest without any auditory warning. Standard protocol in high-density grizzly terrain requires researchers to use vocalizations or auditory devices to prevent a startle response before cresting any blind rise. By stepping alone onto the high ground, Gilbert removed the protection of a 2-person overwatch system and simultaneously eliminated the bear's ability to detect and avoid his approach. The result was mutual surprise at 15 feet. Well inside the animal's defensive threshold for a sow with cubs. The graduate assistant's rapid deployment of vocal deterrence following the initial strike was the direct action that prevented a follow-up attack. The presence of the smoke jumper medical team provided a level of field surgical intervention that cannot be replicated under standard backcountry conditions. And it is not an exaggeration to say that their presence bridged the gap between the ridge and the operating table. Practical takeaway: topography is a wall. A ridge you cannot see over conceals everything on the other side. Never assume a rise is empty because it was quiet a moment ago. Before cresting any blind terrain in grizzly country, especially in documented sow and cub areas, announce your presence loudly and repeatedly. Silence in this context is not professionalism. It is a trigger for a defensive catastrophe. If you've loved these terrifying true stories so far, we need your help to keep sharing them and create new episodes every week. Please grab your phone, scan the QR code now, and tap the subscribe button that opens on your screen.